Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sentinel. This is going to be part two of the discussion with Colonel C.J. Douglas about the Kabul withdrawal. In part one, we discussed about how most of the planning was done at CENTCOM in Tampa, Florida, and how so many general officers were changed during the operation. The most significant being Marsh Sent General Mundy, and more importantly, General Miller, who's the four-star in Kabul, Afghanistan. Right essentially in the middle of the operation, he retires, General Mundy retires, and this had consequences. And the reason for that is because relationships with coalition partners is extremely important. Because these relationships have trust. And once you start changing people out in the middle of the operation, it's a recipe for disaster. And that's exactly what happened here. So we left off part one talking about the ANA, the Afghan National Army, and how we sort of created them in our own image. In part two, we're going to go deeper into that and talk about the Afghan National Army and Colonel Douglas's experiences with them. And we're also going to talk about the investigation and what Colonel Douglas found out while conducting this investigation. Then finally, we're going to talk about command and control. One takeaway that I got from Colonel Douglas's comments was that the 82nd Airborne soldiers knew exactly their chain of command, all the way up to General Donahue, who was stationed with them in Kabul, Afghanistan. While on the Marine side, sort of like this macaroni and cheese command and control. Some Marines were working for the Special Purpose MAGTF that had a different chain of command. Some Marines were working for the BU Expeditionary Unit, a different chain of command, and they kind of just didn't understand this JTF concept. So there's no clarity of command and control on the Marine side, and perhaps that may have caused some problems in terms of disseminating the information down to the Marines and also requesting modifications for the ROE. So command and control is extremely important in combat operations, and this is just basic stuff that you're taught at the lieutenant level. And unfortunately, we didn't grasp it at the senior officer level. Before we start part two, I just want to thank everybody for your support. This is the first time I'm really doing these interviews, and quite frankly, I'm enjoying it because I'm learning a lot. But please bear with me, because a lot of these interviews are being conducted thousands of miles apart. Colonel Douglas happens to be up in New York, so there's a lot of technical issues that I'm still learning, and I appreciate your feedback. There's a lot of feedback about the sound quality. I just bought a brand new microphone. As you can see, this light blinking. So let's see if that works better. But I'm working through all these issues. I'm learning this IT stuff. I'm sort of an infantry guy. Quite frankly, I didn't even know how to turn on a damn computer until a few years back. That's my weakness. I will work on it. But I ask you for your continued patience and your continued feedback. It's important to me because I want to do a good job, and I want to share information with you. There's somebody left a comment that to be an influencer, I need to be. I don't want to be an influencer. I just want to share information. I want to share my experiences, and the main reason I want to share these experiences is so we learn from them, and hopefully we don't make the same mistakes again. And my son, who's also a Marine, him and I both went to war, and I don't want my grandchildren going to war, and I don't want your children going to war, and I don't want your grandchildren going to war either. Nothing good comes out of it. But that doesn't mean that we have to be weak. Don't get me wrong. We need to maintain our strength, and we need to be strong, but we need to be just, and we need to stop going on these foreign misadventures that we continue to go in because they never turn out well. And Afghanistan is a great example. History showed us that Vietnam was another good example. Beirut, Lebanon was another good example. Iraq was another example. So we just keep making these same damn mistakes over and over again because we don't learn lessons. And that's why these podcasts are so important. And having said that, let's dig into part two with Colonel C.J. Douglas.
But to come back to what you were saying, like planning from Tampa is different than planning when you actually know, live, and work with the people that with what you're going to be executing.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
Napoleon said it best, right? The moral is to the physical is 3:1. Like I can think from Tampa, like, I can plan in a vacuum and say, yeah, Afghan security forces are going to provide security for
Right.
this, Kabul, the embassy. That's planning in a vacuum without saying, like, hey, talking to my Afghan counterpart, like, hey, no kidding. Like, if we pull out 100% U.S. personnel, are you going to be able to maintain security at the airfield?
No,
and not just, not, I mean, like at different levels. Like, as you and I both know, you're going to get a different view down at the soldier level than you are
absolutely.
up at the four-star level.
You'll get ground
You know,
truth.
right. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, no, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm, I'm, I'm past tune, and I'm
I'm
up
not
here
sticking
in
around. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
going
I'm
home.
I'm I'm up here in the land of the Hazaras. I'm going
Yeah,
down and defend my family.
yeah.
Like I'm going back to my family. I'm not staying here. Um,
But that's a
so
great point you bring up, CJ. We created the Afghan National Army in our image, right? And and there's a couple of issues. Now, if we harken back, if I can just segue back to 2001, I brought up this off the wall idea, and I get a lot of them, right? Is that we should Afghanistan back then, the entire country's total energy requirement, electricity at the time was 10 megawatts, right? And the country can't move forward into the 19th or the 20th century without power generation. So we tried for years to get the Kajki Dam up and going, right? Marginally
right,
successful, if that. Lost a lot of lives doing it. And so the solution I proposed was putting a nuclear reactor at Bagram. And people thought I was flipping nuts. This is 2001, right? And I said we're gonna be
right,
there, and I was wrong. I said we're gonna be there for 40 years. We're there for 20, right? But imagine if we had done that, and then it becomes a transmission distribution issue, right? Getting the power out to the right people, right?
right,
So now what we did was we created these fake power plants all across Afghanistan. And why I call them fake is because they were gensets, they're generators, these big generators that
right,
we created, which required fuel, right?
right,
To be hauled up from Pakistan, right? Which required safe passage, which required payment to the Taliban to allow safe passage, right? And one of the biggest fears was when the U.S. pulls out, where are they going to get the fuel from?
right,
Right? So that's one part. The second part is spare parts for this high tech military that we started creating. And those warehouses on the other side of Kabul airport, which I'm very familiar with, were full of parts and stuff that got looted and sold in the open market. Now, I've been to Pakistan recently. You can find all that stuff in the markets in Pakistan, in the black markets. All U.S. military gear is being sold there, cheap. We should actually buy it back from there. It'd be a great deal. So my point being is that, when you're sitting in Tampa trying to figure this shit out, it sounds great on paper when you're having these lofty thoughts of coup de oui and sitting there and debating these issues, in the planning cells. But the reality is on the ground. When you're talking to
right,
that unit commander, the police chief in that district, and he's telling you, hey, I haven't been paid in 3 months. My morale sucks, right? The salaries aren't being paid to my people. Somebody's taking them, and they used to tell us this stuff. You know this. You remember
right.
these days, right?
Yep,
And there's being skimmed on the top, the corruption and all that stuff. Or that 30% of the Afghan National Army didn't exist. They were just names on paper, so the commanders could be making money, from the
right,
salaries. So all these things, and Miller knew about all this. He knew all
right,
where the cobwebs were and the dark secrets of everything. That's why he said this whole thing's going to fall apart. And guess what happened? You mentioned it. Ashraf Ghani takes the first flight out. Now,
right,
rumor has it he took millions of dollars with him. We don't know that, right? But he's the
right.
he's the first one out because he knew exactly what Miller. When he saw Miller leave, he knew the backbone wasn't there. I'm out of here. I'm taking the first
Yep,
helicopter and whatever. And they're saying that they have to actually ditch stuff from the helicopter. These are my contacts are saying just to carry his suitcases full of money. They actually left people behind, some of his guards, just so he could add another suitcase of whatever millions of dollars that he's hauling out of there. And I think they should find him and bring him to justice, in my opinion, for stealing U.S. tax revenue. Anyway, so getting back to the point that we talked about command and control. Let's talk about a little bit about the force protection from your analysis at Kabul airport. Or how could we have now? We understand everything's falling apart. The plan is gone. It's vaporized, right? It doesn't exist.
right.
But comment on the force protection issue and bring in the investigation that you were involved in, um, and what you learned from that.
can I touch back on a previous point before
Of
going to
course.
that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So when you mentioned, and because many of our experiences are very similar. When I was back and when I was as an advisor in the 13-14 time period with the Second Brigade, there's 2 points. One is the commander had said, I need help with one of our generators. Do you have a generator mechanic? I do. "Uh, We can fix that. So,
Yeah.
hey, this is easy. Joint
Yeah.
or a combined patrol, of Afghans, US.
Yeah.
We patrol there. I got my generator mech. We get, ground our gear on the vehicles, like it's all about rapport. Your
Yeah.
PSD is mine. As we're walking up and we're walking, he's leading me to where the generator is. And as we're approaching, I'm hearing this dong, dong, this metallic clanging noise. And so, we're talking, and I'm like, gosh, I wonder what that is. And I just continue to hear it. And so we stop in front of what appears to be a large structure, metallic structure. And this clanging is coming from inside. And I'm like, where's the generator? And he's like, well, that Colonel CJ, that's the generator. And I'm like, I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, this is like that scene in Jaws. Like, I think we're
Yeah.
gonna need a
Yeah.
bigger, like, I think I'm gonna need a bigger generator mechanic.
Yeah.
And so, the door opens and this um, small Afghan
Yeah.
comes out and he's holding a pipe
Nice.
wrench. And, like, Assalamu alaikum. And I'm like,
Yeah.
like, and so like we walk inside this thing like I'm going into a house. It's that
Yeah.
big.
Yeah.
It's and he shows and he's trying to hammer something off. And I'm like, and so I look at my generator mechanic and he's like, so I've never seen anything this big. Like
Yeah.
I'm picturing generator, I'm picturing
They're
like,
yeah.
like,
They're like
and
a
so he's like,
megawatt each.
this got turned over to us when your forces left. And I'm like,
Yeah. And they
okay,
didn't
so
give us any injectors. The injectors, that's what it was called. I guarantee it.
yeah,
I know this stuff.
grab
Yeah.
that camera, take pictures, like, okay, hey, you know what, we're gonna work on this. It comes to fruition, like when the forces left, they did fill it with gas, but there was no maintenance, no like parts or anything. The
Yeah.
parts weren't even available. I forget what country they
Yes.
were from. And so then this goes back to, as like everything came swimming, and I'm like, okay, a generator from the bazaar costs X. And if
Yeah.
I need repairs, I can grab this guy with the pipe wrench from the bazaar and he'll
Yeah.
come replace it or repair it or whatever it. But now, and then that transposes to the 283 down vehicles from battle damage, from maintenance, from whatever that the brigade had. So they had no mobility, so they couldn't conduct operations because they're all stuck down in the core for maintenance. But it's because they didn't have parts. But it's like we determine it's this complex problem that was with a crafting of US, but most importantly, because we might as well just give them spaceships.
Yeah.
Like quite frankly, when we talk about developing the wrong force, yeah, a mirror image of us, when what they needed was guys that could mass on an objective. Like, hey, the Taliban massed on an objective on motorcycles. The Afghan security forces could have done the same thing.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? Chest rigs, AK-47s, which I had one come to me on one of these ops, and he's got his M16 A2, and the barrel's bent. And he's like, "Is this a problem?" I'm like, thinking to myself, well, you're probably not going to be shooting around any corners or at all with that. Like, hey, he needs a new rifle. He wouldn't have bent an AK. Like an M4 for me, for you, for all of my
Yeah.
guys,
Yeah.
we're going to maintain it. That they needed the ability to get on a motorcycle with something, shoot some people on the objective, retrograde, or live with the local populace, but in a tribal fashion, and then us to say, hey, like Buster Howes, who had spoken once, and we've communicated since. He had articulated it's like, hey, what's worth fighting for, or what's worth living for, what's worth fighting for, what would you die for, what would you kill for, what would you do to defend your family? Like he
Hmm.
laid it out more articulately, and it was Like for me, it was very compelling, and it was before going into Afghanistan. Um, and and that came to mind a number of times because as people would say, hey, nothing here is worth dying for, then all right, why we're here? If the mission is to remain safe, why didn't I just stay at home in the US and stay under my bed? Like you, remind me and the American people why we're here. I'm on board. I raised my right hand. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. You're telling me this is worth it? I'm in. Don't tell me it's too risky, because otherwise, then why are we here? So when we looked at, creating the wrong force, yeah, we created the wrong force, and everybody owns that. But now, as we fast forward and we're into, the preparation and coordination and execution of those withdrawal, hey, you know, we know everybody owns a part of that as well, but we know when it came time to leave, now that the lack of coordination with the Afghan security forces and the fact that even the Taliban, and we'll talk more about that, is like yep, I've got respect for them, and I did even when they're fighting them. But the thing to remember is, like, with the U.S., when I want to talk to somebody in charge, it's like we talk command and control. Like, it's a
Right.
unity of command. Everybody falls under one person. With the
Right.
Taliban, and you can correct me if I'm wrong,
No, you're
but I
right.
believe
Yeah.
it's more
No
a
worries.
unity of effort,
Yeah.
because Helmand Taliban are way different than Kabul
Yes.
Taliban.
Yes.
Like, they're Taliban, but they're different, as are any of others, many other region. So that, like, is there one central figure?
No.
Well, not really. It's kind of like, hey, we all have the same ideology. Well, I
Ideas.
don't want to do that.
Ideas. Yes.
Well, it's not like, hey, well, I'm going to NJP you if you don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, Somehow or another, it's going to get done, which then leads into, as we then, need their assistance during the withdrawal when we talk force protection.
Let me
Hoping to
just
go off the rails too much.
no, no, you're right on the money. I mean, so when we're talking about the Afghan, I mean, this is great. I love it. When you're talking about the Afghan National Army, now, if you go back to the National Day parades, you go back to the videos, and I'll try to find one and watch how they're marching on the National Day parades under our tutelage, our
Right,
mentoring, our cadre, and then fast forward into 2022 National Day
right,
Parade and see how well they're marching. I mean, they look like professional soldiers marching under the Taliban.
right,
Think about that, right? The discipline that they all of a sudden overnight that the Afghan National Army, grew into. It's mind blowing stuff. I watch these videos and I'm like, holy smokes, why couldn't they do that when we were there? Because they didn't
right,
want to. It was a game, right? And that's the part that we forget. The longer this conflict continues on, the more resource. Nobody gives a shit about Afghanistan, right? Nobody cares, right? And I hate to say this because they're wonderful people, but the problem is this: the only thing they had to export was poppy, right? Was
right,
heroin that was going through. And I worked, on the drug side in Afghanistan and Pakistan, so I know a little bit about it. But when the Taliban came in the first time, they basically abolished the poppy, the heroin trade, right?
yep,
They abolished it. When we came in, it pumped back up to about 90% of the world's heroin. We were producing under our tutelage because they weren't really paying attention to us. When the Taliban says X, Y, and Z, everybody knows. You could today take a wallet, leave it on the side on the road in Kandahar, and nobody will touch it because they know they're going to get their hand chopped off, right? So
right,
that's discipline, right? That's enforced
right,
discipline, and in that part of the world, it works. We
right,
just didn't have that capacity because we're more in the, let's be lovey-dovey and the gummy bear type. It doesn't work over there. So that's the first mistake
right,
we made. The second we made was we tried to take, DEI, in my opinion, started in Afghanistan. It didn't start in Washington, D.C., because we tried to take the Hazaras, the Uzbeks, the Panjshiris, the Pashtuns, and try to kludge them into one homogeneous unit. It doesn't work. They hate each other, right? And it goes back thousands of years. Thousands of years it goes back.
right,
Rather than following a pattern that the British left, next country over in Pakistan. In Pakistan, you've got the Sindh Regiment, conventionally based. You got the Baloch Regiment. You got the Punjab Regiment. You got the Frontier Regiment, with the Pashtuns. Each province has their own regiments from their own
right,
people. And it works because they've got pride. They believe in their province. They trust each other. In Afghanistan, nobody trusted anybody. They trusted the
Right.
Americans more than they trusted the guy next to them because they knew we'd give them a fair deal, right? They knew that
Yep.
you'd come to their help to fix the generator, right? Uh,
Right.
so it's and the corruption that we embedded, enabled and embedded to the Afghans. We were responsible. They weren't corrupt. Their corruption was nickel and dime stuff. $5 here, $10 there. But the corruption that we brought into the country went into millions of dollars. I know some people that were dirt poor in Afghanistan. The first government contract I was involved in, we bought pebble rocks from riverbed rocks, right?
Right.
To keep the dust down. That guy
Right.
became a billionaire. I won't take his name. He became a billionaire from government contracts because we made him a governor. And then all these other Afghans that showed up from different places because they knew the money was there, you know.
Right.
And the problem is all that money never got down to the rural areas. Their lives never changed, right?
Right.
But they were harassed in the middle of the night. Some soft team would come and do a raid on their compound and wake everybody up and tie people up and all that stuff, and they hated it. And this is
Mhm.
where the Taliban became even more popular, right? Because the Taliban saying this is wrong, this is wrong. I'll tell you what, if I was in charge, we spent on the average about a hundred billion dollars a year on Afghanistan on the average, right? 100 billion. I could have done the same thing for 1 billion. You know how? I would have hired the Taliban.
Yeah.
I just give them the contract. You run the security of this country, and I'll tell you what, it would have worked
Right.
perfect, right? And then you come some sort of political arrangement on top to run it. But we try
Yeah.
to do this nation building stuff. It doesn't work. We don't understand the culture. We don't understand the languages. I'll give you a simple example. Okay, eating pork. Simple example. Pork MREs, right?
Right.
I mean, you talk about some serious issue, right?
Yep.
They get energized on that stuff, and because these are the things that the Taliban exploits in their IO
Right.
campaign. These guys are bringing in pig meat, blah blah blah. They don't believe in God, and all that stuff. And it plays to an illiterate population. When 70% of the country is literally illiterate, it plays to
Right.
them, right? So whatever some literate guy says, they're going to listen to him, as you well know. But getting back to the force protection side
Yep.
of it, please talk about that and what you found out in your investigation also.
Right. So, what we found out in the investigation. So, one of the things that I'll say to kind of set the conditions for this is the investigation as I was involved is an AR-15-6. It's similar to a JAGMAN that we do. And so basically there's an investigating officer and then a number of other investigating officers that assist the lead investigator. And so we had a one-star, Army one-star, phenomenal, phenomenal guy, ultimate respect for him. I love him. He was in charge, a man of integrity. I was his assistant. He had his JAG, and
Right.
that's the team. And we had,
Now, let me just
initially
ask, who did the one
yeah,
star work for?
he worked for he was forward deployed, so technically he worked for ARCENT. He came out of Fort Bragg. He was a logistics officer, um, third third TSC maybe.
So
I'm not sure of the
did,
unit,
did he
but
belong to
ultimately,
CENTCOM or was he
so out of
independent? Yeah, so
he
he wasn't
was
independent.
he was independent. Um, and so he, and so he, needed a Marine for the team. So I transitioned from assisting with the evacuation because all the evacuees were now complete out of Qatar. And it's like, the next call I got was, hey, contact um, Brigadier General Lance Curtis. He's, you've got a SIPR email and it's an appointment letter and you work for him. So it's like, hey, we got 10 days. We got to look into and the laid out what the scope was. And so it was the actions at Abbey Gate before, during, and after the blast. Was the command and control right? And then there was there a complex attack? So it's all these things. And when we say it, you've laid out in a previous podcast about the levels of war. Um, and so tactical, operational, strategic, political. And so we're talking the basic level, like,
Right.
is
Squad.
really where ours is. I mean, I would submit really ours, our investigation covered, up to the battalion command level. We interviewed people above that and the highest being US 4A, Admiral Vasely, his staff, um, Brigadier General Sullivan, his staff, Major General Donahue, his staff, and then down to the battalion, the special purpose MAGTAF, and all the subordinate elements, all the way down to the fire team level.
Right.
So that's it. Um, so what we as we started up high and worked our way down and ultimately got to the Marines that were providing the security throughout the time period in the Abbey corridor. So starting from landing and having to assist with clearing the runway because the runway was overrun by
Right.
evacuees, to then clearing and establishing the separate checkpoints, as far as that were around the airfield, and then working our way through. There was 60 different threat streams leading up to the final blast that that they were tracking there, and within the task force, within US 4A, within the 82nd. And so, ultimately, as that happened, they began to close down all the different checkpoints. And, the last remaining ones, there was like they did a force protection assessment. So you looked at the north, the north gate, as it was called, was controlled by one of the units from the MEU. And in order to make, so it was a corridor, it was, walled, and it was filled with, as far as you could see, with people,
Yeah.
just like locked together. And so the Marines, in order to let people in, they had an MRAP that was
Hmm.
against the gate, and they would basically back the MRAP up a hair. It would open the door a little bit. They'd grab, they'd be stacked up in a formation. They'd pull somebody through and then, push the gate closed. And when you think about it from a force protection standpoint, they could have pulled a suicide bomber
Sure.
through that, right? Because it's like at some point, and I know you mentioned it before about you've got this outer perimeter security of Afghans, and I remember at the time there was if you Googled Afghan security checkpoints Kabul,
Hmm.
there was like you got live images on of where the where the Taliban checkpoints were.
Right.
So, I'm trying to get my way to Kabul, and I'm like, all right, I know there's a Taliban checkpoint there. I just need to go through these alleyways to avoid them. In addition to, you had elected officials and U.S. service members that were providing maps. No kidding, map, and you're chuckling because you've seen them
Yeah.
with with lines drawn,
How to get in there.
right to Abbey Gate. And so, because as the evacuation was going on, was progressing, and as it became more untenable to get to any of these other checkpoints, specifically the north, like initially the Abbey Gate or the Abbey corridor, and we say gate, it's really, if as you've seen, it's a
Yeah.
long corridor. They had established these shipping containers, so they called
Hmm.
it the Chevron because basically it funneled people towards the Baron Hotel or
Hmm.
into the perimeter. So it's, UK people are going to get funneled that way, US people in this way. Now, so it's like you've got the canal that runs, and so
Hmm.
that was really a surface, right? It's like a canal. It's like waist deep water.
Yeah.
Who wants to jump down into this sewage? And so, with this, you've got Marines providing security, and you've got State Department personnel that show up and like, all right, we're only taking U.S. citizens. Okay. Now the coordination begins. As we mentioned before, right? This is unity of effort because Taliban at this gate are saying, okay, we're only taking this. Taliban, now all of a sudden the State Department says, hey, we're now going to extend it to green card holders. So U.S. citizens, green card holders. What's a green card holder? And as you mentioned,
Yeah.
illiterate, like I'm trying to explain to somebody,
Yeah.
and even if I'm showing a picture, this is what a green card looks like. What,
Yeah.
I don't even
You
know
don't.
what that
Yeah. You
is.
don't know.
So, but the Taliban over here are saying, we're not honoring that. We don't have to honor that. We're
Yeah.
only going with U.S. citizens. So as it evolves, it gets to the point where finally the Taliban that are, in the perimeter at the chevron say, and it's this sea of people. Yeah, I don't care if you're George F. and Bush, you are not
Yeah. Yeah.
not letting another person through until you get figured out who is allowed through. So that's it. Now that the chevron is a surface,
Hmm.
so much like water seeking the path of least resistance,
Right.
somebody gets coordinated with one of the non-governmental groups, like, hey, jump in the canal and I'll have somebody pull you out.
Yeah.
Walk your way up to the Marines, hold up this pineapple and boom, you're out. Well, then, now we see a surge of people over the days. So, as the units rotate out, one unit that's providing security gets, replaced by ultimately the Marines that are there when the blast happens. And, the previous unit, Echo Company, they come back, they're like, what happened? Like it wasn't like this when we left. What'd you guys do? So, that said, and it wasn't that they did anything, it's just that all the other gates closed down. And this is, what we determined from the investigation. And everybody was getting funneled through. And because now the Taliban weren't letting anybody through the main gate, everybody was bypassing it. So now you've got
Right.
this canal that's full and no way to deny other than put Marines there. So this goes to this is setting the conditions for your force
Right.
protection question. So you've got, these, just this sea of humanity in front of these Marines that are basically, the standing there, preventing them from, or I shouldn't say preventing them, pulling, providing passage to people that have met the State Department criteria for processing. So
Right.
that said, now is when, and this is during the time that they've, impending attack, continues to, the warning signs for an impending attack are growing stronger. So, you could say like pause here for a minute, like force protection wise, does this meet the criteria? No, it's inadequate. I mean, it now, but that said, the initial idea of being searched by the Taliban, um, flawed in is I'm not going to say it's like this is the one of those where it's like hope's not a method. Well, that's kind of what we are right now is we're hoping that the Taliban, but now that they're bypassing the Taliban, they're not getting screened. So now
Right.
you've got essentially what's really the preponderance of a company standing there preventing a terrorist attack, with their bodies as shields, and you've got it's only got it the terrorist has got to be get it right once, because even if they were
Sure.
behind shields whatever, um there's at some point they're still going to have to put a hand out and pull somebody in, and that somebody that they pull in could be the bomber. So, how do you fix that, right? Well, I mean, it's like, okay, pause operations. Say, we put up some protective barriers. Maybe we, move some barriers in that, maybe we contract the Taliban to clear everybody out, but then we're back in the same issue of because the Taliban, I mean, we saw, from the investigation, and it shows in the redacted one. General Donahue was at Southgate at one point, which is owned by the 82nd, and surging evacuees broke the gate, much like entering, and so they flooded it.
Mm.
General Donahue had said to the Taliban leader, he was like, "Clear this, this is you. This is what you're here for. Push them
Right.
back," and they did. I mean, in their own Taliban way with
Sure.
rubber hoses, they pushed people back, and so it was possible. Um, but at the Marine level, at the individual, the team leader, the squad, the platoon commander, and even the company commander, like they had they had a hellacious task that they were right in the middle of, and like face to face, so that even when we, when you look at interviewing, like I might know who was on my right, who was on my left. I might know an event that happened on my right and left, but I couldn't tell you who was next to that person.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then we saw that. So literally, it was like interviewing. Well, who was on your left and right? Okay, who was on your left and right? Confirmation. Okay, he who said you were. In some cases, we found, oh no, there was somebody else that were in between you. So, which all led to, the force protection, was now they had guardian angels positioned, as you know from testimony
Right.
of um, and at the time, as we learned from the investigation, they had ECMs, electronic countermeasures. So the whole purpose of those, for anybody who doesn't know, is
So
deny cell signals, right? So, basically it makes it so that if I'm a terrorist and I have
remote
a bomb
detonated.
and I plant it, I can't remotely detonate it. It's got to be somebody physically has to detonate it. And as we saw, it was a personal born IED or a PBIED, a person who, was the command detonated the
Right.
blast.
Now, I guess my question would be, I mean, that's close up, right? So the force protection
Right.
close up, obviously, we got the sea of humanity coming at you, but what was the
Right.
plan to keep that sea of humanity at a safe distance, and then checking these people at that distance and allowing only the ones that are qualified to be processed to approach the perimeter of the airport? What was that plan?
Yeah. And so what that looked like was, I'm in the canal and I'm holding up my US ID or my green card or my embassy pass, or
Yeah,
any of the criteria, or I'm holding up as many had gotten thank you letters from, that's
yeah.
what it was. And so
But
it was a,
how do they get to that canal? That's my point. Well, I mean, because
yeah,
every what percentage of those people were the ones that were evacuated, and these other people that just showed up trying to get a hitch a ride, right? I mean,
yeah.
see,
And so that's just it.
so there
It
was
was
no
such a mix
mechanism.
of both that it took, like, so you could see it talking to the Marines, and you can see from some of the footage that was taken by combat
Yeah,
camera, it took a Marine leaning down and going, "Let me see your paperwork." Like, whose person's
yeah,
down in
yeah,
the
yeah,
canal. What it was
yeah.
supposed to be was, the Taliban looking and saying, "Hey, here's your documents."
Yeah.
Like, you know what? You're not coming
They
in here.
can't they can't read, so it
They
ain't
can't
gonna.
read. Right.
Okay, so
So,
what about a plan? I mean, this is the problem I got. It's
yeah,
this reactive thinking. So what about a plan about a surface-borne evacuation to Turkmen border to Pakistan, which is about 120 miles away? Load them up in buses, and there's plenty of them in Kabul, and take
right.
and get safe passage with the Taliban. They control the roads anyway, and work it out with Pakistan that these people go to Pakistan, and Pakistan has refugee camps because it's got the largest refugee populations of Afghans, about 4 to 5 million of them, right? So why wasn't that considered for all these non-essential personnel that warranted evacuation? To be sent that way down that road instead of everybody coming to the airport. Why didn't that happen?
Well, I mean, that's not. I mean, you can't do that. That's not how you do a Neo.
Okay, I
I'm
got you.
I'm being
I
sarcastic.
know. Yeah, no, no, I
'Cause,
agree
I
with
mean,
you.
like, no, that's brilliant. Like, yeah, I mean, well, that's a great idea. Like, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, something different that was being done would have been brilliant. I mean,
yeah.
it's like, I think it's incestuous amplification is the only thing I can say, right? So, kind of like kind of Boyd. It's like, it's a misaligned orientation, right? So, I've got my observations like, hey, geez, we got all these evacuees. Like, well, some of them are, some of them aren't.
Yeah,
And so it's like, whoa, we've got to process them all. So I've got this misaligned orientation, which then leads to
just
a
chaos.
misaligned decision and action. And so, yeah, so to your point, like, hey, like, guess what? We want to load all these people up in buses. We're going to contract buses. Again, goes back
But
to,
we don't even have to do that. All you have to do is make an announcement. Go to
yeah,
Torcom. We're going to process you through Pakistan. They would have gone. They
right,
would have figured it out, right?
exactly,
Or go to Bagram. We'll process you
right,
there
yep,
and shut down Kabul. I mean, these are just simple
right,
on the ground decisions But you have
Right.
to be thinking. The problem is once you become part of this chaos,
Right.
then you stop
You're
thinking,
part of it.
right? Yeah,
Exactly. And that's why
that's
I say it's incestuous amplification.
right.
It's like, and this goes back to, so, as far as, when you think back to General Mundy up and out, like, you need that person who's uninvolved
Right.
or the leadership that's like taking a call from the president, taking a call from the first lady, or sitting around huddled listening to, and like, load aircraft, like, okay, load aircraft. It does what it's told. Like, hey, you're 100% correct. There is another option. There's always another option.
Yeah. I guess my issue is, this mindset. I never understood it because when I was a battalion commander, we had to get clearance to drop munitions from the KOC, right? The Combined
Right.
Air Operations Center in Qatar, right? And I could never understand the logic of some guy sitting 3,000 miles away from me, making that, having the authority to refuse, right?
Right.
And so, in my mind, first of all, I don't understand why Central Command's in Tampa, right? Geographic locations. So that's the
Right.
first part. The second
Right.
part is how different is Qatar than Tampa,
Right.
right? If the operations are going to Afghanistan, forward means you're
Forward.
in, yeah, you're at Bagram or Kabul or, wherever.
Shared.
That's what,
Right.
yeah. So that's what forward means, right? So, I mean, so that becomes the focus of effort. So unfortunately, I think this is one of the drawbacks in our military is we've got these echelons that we create, these layers, right? And once these layers are created, information doesn't really freely flow through those layers, right? So that's why
Right.
the commanders, the decision makers, have to be forward. And forward doesn't mean Cutter. Now, Mackenzie was hopping back from Tampa to Cutter, and then, the Lincoln was in the Hamptons. And granted, they've got all the comms, right? Now, the sexy thing is I've got the comms, I can touch it. But you,
Yeah.
you got to feel it, you got to smell it, you
Right.
got to,
Yeah.
this. And
It's the sight, the smell,
yeah,
the perspective of on the ground. You cannot put a price on it. Like it's like
yeah,
I can tell you how bad the evacuation is, but unless you actually see it,
yeah.
like then you can't appreciate it.
And I think the important part about redirecting the mass of humanity in another direction or multiple different directions. Say, hey, go to Bagram. If you're an American passport holder, civilian, right, not a U.S. government
Right.
employee, you will be extracted out of Bagram. We'll see you
Right.
there, right? So those people go up there. If you're a green card holder or somebody, an Afghan that worked for the U.S. government, head to Pakistan. We'll process you there. And the problem solves itself because they'll figure it
Right.
out. They're desperate, right? They're the ones that want to get out. And then you work it out with the Taliban. Hey, and pay them $10 a person. Every person you let go of for $10. And money
Right.
talks. You know this. So there's
Yeah.
different ways of handling all that. So I mean, so we kind of hit on the force protection. It was just chaotic, right? So you're face to face. So there essentially is no force protection, right? Everybody's
Right.
piled on each other. The ROE, now there's a discussion, and I put a clip in mine where there was a sergeant that speaks to that he thinks he saw the terrorist and talked to his battalion commander uh, and wasn't allowed to engage this person because nobody had the authority. So please talk to us a little bit about the ROE and who controlled the ROE. Obviously, there's the CENTCOM standing
Right.
ROE, but was there any
But
specific ROEs for this operation?
but the specific one that we determined was, hey, an inherent right of self-defense, right?
Yeah,
Hostile act, hostile intent. So, that's the basic one that carries all of us through. Like anything outside of that, obviously General Mackenzie. Now that said, you know, one of the things that we talked to is command and control, and this is going to tie into the complications of ROEs. Depending on who you talk to in the different elements, and I'll say specific to Abbey Gate, East Gate, North Gate. No problem with the Army. If you asked who was in charge, hey, my platoon commander, like they'd
yeah,
give you the right up to General Donahue. If you ask that on the Marine side, in a lot of cases, there are a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Um, Now, that then comes down to like, hey, if they worked for the BLT, or I'm sorry, the SP MAGTF, they knew
Yeah.
my company, my platoon commander, a squad leader, platoon commander, company commander, battalion commander.
Yeah.
Above that,
No
they,
clue.
you know, and it took because it turned out it's like, well, they worked for the 24th MU command element, who was in charge of both the SP MAGTF and the BLT. Uh, okay, well, but the JTF commander was working directly to the battalion commander. So, the battalion commander was like, my
Who's
boss
my
was the
boss?
JTF. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, that's confusing. So it's like, who do you go to when you say, hey, we got a problem with the rule of engagement. Hey, listen, things are a little sporty down here. We need to modify these.
Right.
Or it's, and again, and so the belief that like risk aversion is a thing now in the Marine Corps. And I'll say, now I've been retired 2 years at this point, so maybe it's changed since I left, but
It hasn't.
um,
No.
yeah, I mean, it was alive and well. And so, this comes down to, so with this is like, um, it's the the fact is, with the ambiguity of the situation, with the inconsistency of information about the pending attack, like it's going to be a suicide bomber. Okay.
Yeah.
That leads to, is it going to be a vehicle? Is it going to be a person? Is it, what's it going to be? So the initial thought, and this is why Northgate and Eastgate closed down, was because they're like, it's going to be a vehicle. Okay.
Mm. Yeah.
So So now you close down Northgate because like, hey, Northgate, it's, if you look the way it was oriented, the traffic circle was just to the northeast. And so
Hmm.
it would have created a great breach point for a follow-on attack and US casualties and evacuees. So like, well, let's close this down. Eastgate, same thing. You had that issue. So now we're down to Abbey, where there's a, like standoff. But again, this is before we have this surge of people that have now entered the Abbey,
The
the
funnel.
canal. They were on the
Yeah.
far side.
Yeah.
Now entered the canal. And so as now it's like clearly there's one point of entry and we're pulling everybody out of there. And it's like, hey, we're getting information that, the attack is imminent. So boom, they'd shut down operations, take a knee, minimize people. And
Right.
at one point, the night before, they were supposed to close, cease operations. And this is in the investigation. They're supposed to cease, and they delayed because it's like
Right.
whether it was hey, the Brits were there, whatever it is, they delayed, um, but they took a knee from like 2300 until like 08, or 07. It was all night because they were like, we got an attack coming. So they, hey, there's potential attack. And they're like, okay, I guess we'll resume bringing people in. And they're like, hey, there's a possible attack coming, everybody down. And that happened a number of times during the day until ultimately there
Yeah.
was an attack.
Stop and go. Stop and
So
go.
that's it. So, as I mentioned, or I started to mention, we interviewed everyone, we interviewed as many people as we could, right? Now I
Yep.
mentioned the size of the team. And we did over 170 interviews, um, in the course of as many days as we did. Interviewed all of the snipers except one,
Mm.
and that was Sergeant
Yeah.
Marcus Andrews, who you played a clip from on your show, and so I'd say the question I would ask is, why didn't anybody interview him? And the answer is really quite simple. It's not nefarious. He was in critical condition. He was
Right.
unable to be.
Sure.
And so,
Yeah.
given the scope, the time, one, the scope, like, hey, this is the focus of your investigation. Even if I want to interview,
But
okay,
let me just interrupt.
Who
Yeah.
gave you that focus of
That
investigation?
came from the CENTCOM commander. This is
Well,
kind
the
of
reason,
like
yeah,
cheating at chess, right?
yeah.
Or,
So that's why I asked you who the
yeah,
people belong
yeah,
to. So the
yeah,
lead investigator is from Arcent, the brigadier
yeah.
general. Okay, his
Right. So,
deputy, you are from Marcent,
yep.
right?
Yep. So all out of CENTCOM. We
Yeah,
all work ultimately. And so, and again, at what level is the investigation? Well, you know what level it isn't?
yeah,
CENTCOM. Yeah,
yeah,
it's down here.
yeah.
And I'll tie that up with a nice bow at the end. But
Okay.
In wrapping up part two, I mean, we talked about a lot of really good stuff. I really like part two because it was pretty fairly intense, the conversation, and there's a lot of good ideas that came out of it. And the reason I enjoyed it because there's so many lessons that we discussed with Colonel Douglas. The main thing was the Afghan National Army, and in our attempts to create them in our own image, we failed because we made them too high tech rather than keep them low tech and effective for their environment. I think that's very important. And the next thing we talked about was investigation. There's a very important point here. That investigation, in my mind, was cheating at chess. And the reason being is that investigation was conducted, although independent, was conducted by people that are assigned to Central Command. That wasn't really truly an independent investigation. Having CENTCOM conduct its own investigation makes no sense to me. It's almost like cheating at solitaire, right? And I know Mackenzie. I know the type of investigations he does, and he knows how to manipulate them. So we really need to be cautious of that to make sure that investigations are truly independent and done at a higher level than the command that's being investigated. So there's none of this manipulation and all this stuff that happens typically in military investigations. So I think that's very, very important. And lastly is our discussion on command and control. I mean, it just boggles my mind that the Marines didn't have clarity in command and control. I mean, that should never happen. Every Marine that is risking his life should know who the hell he works for. And he should know who his general is all the way to the top. Command and control is a fundamental issue. I mean, that's just unbelievable to me. And the reason it's unbelievable to me because you've got the four-star general operating out of Tampa and Qatar. He might as well be on the moon when he should have been 24/7 at Kabul International Airport trying to find better alternatives. Maybe send people to Bagram. An airplane can fly just as easy to Bagram than it did at Kabul. Maybe tell people to, hey, get to the Pakistani border, we'll process you there. There were many other options that weren't considered because we just kept reinforcing failure. And you can't reinforce failure because ultimately, if you do that, you're just going to keep failing. You got to find a better alternative. And unfortunately, our thinking generals weren't thinking. And I'd be interested to hear your comments on this. And also, hit a like, a share, and a subscribe. That's all I got. Stay rugged. Con out.